Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of The Counselor. Now, I was really looking forward to this movie. The trailers made it look like it was going to be great. I love the cast. You have an interesting mix of, A-listers like Brad Pitt and Cameron Diaz, and then people who aren't as famous, but they have a lot of respect within the industry, like Javier Bardem and Michael Fassbender, who are definitely, titans in terms of their abilities, but they don't usually get as many major roles like Brad Pitt does. And then you have the people who you might not recognize by name, but you at least remember them by face, such as Ruben Blades. Even though I know who Ruben Blades is, I don't think the majority of the audience is going to memorize his name. But then, of course, it's being directed by Ridley Scott. Now, Ridley Scott is an interesting director because he's very hit or miss as a filmmaker, and it's strange because his misses aren't bad movies. Like, I wouldn't call Legend a bad film, I wouldn't call Robin Hood a bad film. They just, for some reason, don't really work, and they should be so much better, even though there's a lot of great stuff within them. It's odd how his misfires tend to misfire. But at least the majority of his films have acquired cult followings, even the ones that aren't considered very good, like Legend. And then, of course, his classics are, Blade Runner, Alien. I really liked Body of Lies. I know I'm like the only one who feels that way. And then his cut of Kingdom of Heaven was pretty good, even though the cut down version they released for theaters was pretty bad. He's the total opposite of his brother, the late Tony Scott, I noticed, where Tony Scott is very consistent with his films, but he rarely makes great movies, but then he rarely releases duds either, so he kind of balances it out, whereas Ridley Scott is either his films are really good or really disappointing. So I was hoping that The Counselor would be one of the really good ones, but then I was really concerned when it was released for the critics, and most of the reviews seemed pretty negative, or at least it wasn't so much that The Counselor was bad as much as it was just really disappointing. So I figured I'd scale down my expectations, but I went ahead and watched it anyway. And man, this is a difficult movie to talk about because it's not bad. I don't even want to say it's mediocre, but I do believe it was a misfire. But it's a misfire that I could see some people really liking too. I'm not even really sure where to begin. Well, while I was watching the film, my interest kept drifting in and out of the movie. Sometimes I was totally into it, then other times I was like, God, is this almost over yet? It's only been 25 minutes? No! But I really could not point out what I thought it was doing wrong, because, yes, while it was incredibly slow, slow doesn't necessarily mean bad. It doesn't even mean boring. I mean, Once Upon a Time in the West is one of my favorite films, and that is about as slow-paced as you can get. So then after the movie, I was also once again trying to piece together my problems, and I was able to figure out certain things that I did not like, but overall I was kind of surprised that I was thinking throughout the majority of the film that I was going to concede that it was a decent movie, but it just didn't do much for me. But then I eventually realized what the problem was when I got confused. And I'm kind of rambling a bit here, so I apologize, and it's probably going to get worse. But I remember the trailer stating that this was written by the guy who did No Country for Old Men. Now, I immediately presumed that was the movie, but then I kind of remembered that the Coen brothers wrote that, so I did my research, and it turns out the writer had actually written the novel of No Country for Old Men, and that's what his primary occupation is. He's a novelist, not a screenwriter. And immediately I realized what made The Counselor kind of fail. You see, it's written in a way that would work for a novel, but not a movie. Now, movies are very direct. They're much more linear than books are. You have, of course, movies that focus more on the plot. You get from A to B, and everything in between is supposed to relate to those 2 points. Or you could have a character drama where it's just about the life of this person who the film is focusing on, but at least everything feels relevant because it's how they affect that character. But with books, it's more about immersing the viewer into the character's world. So there's a lot more content that might not necessarily be relevant to the primary story, but it still works because, once again, it's more about the world than the plot itself. So, for example, Jaws, which actually is a much more simplistic book than the majority of the novels I've read. You have, of course, the story of these guys trying to get to the shark, but you have a bunch of other stuff that really kind of feels superfluous, like a whole mob tie-in, or the wife starts having an affair. That kind of stuff wasn't used for the movie because it added nothing to the primary story, which was hunting down the shark. And I feel that the problem with The Counselor is that there's definitely a novelist mentality to it. So there's a lot of scenes that don't really feel relevant, but if this was a novel format, they actually would have worked really well. So, just a few scenes, for example, you have Cameron Diaz kind of harassing this priest. I thought that was kind of an odd scene to have because it didn't really lead anywhere. But in the book, it would have fit more because there's more time dedicated to the characters, and an ensemble piece like this, you could even flesh out the supporting cast. Whereas in this movie, I felt it was superfluous because the primary character was supposed to be Michael Fassbender's character, and everybody else was supposed to be the supporting character. But you have so many scenes dedicated to these. These aren't irrelevant characters, but they once again aren't the primary focus, that I just thought took away from him, and it made his character kind of vague in comparison to these more interesting and fleshed out characters. But it never really goes anywhere. Then there's this one scene with John Leguizamo where he has a cameo, and it's supposed to showcase just a dark aspect of this world that I just didn't feel fit within the movie. But if it was in a novel format, it would have really added to the atmosphere. Now, people might disagree with me. You might think that these scenes were actually incredibly important, that they did tie in with the characters and their personalities and motivations, and that in a way it was much more of an ensemble piece where it was really about this world and why you should stay away from it. But I did not feel that way at all as I was watching it, so I guess that's more of a subjective thing. But to me, there was just so many wasted space. There's so much wasted space within this film, so I often did get bored. I thought it was unreasonably slow at parts, and various scenes might be important, but they also seem incredibly drawn out. And I felt all that it really struck me as Ridley Scott is catering to the highbrow audience, and it just feels incredibly artificial for it. The dialogue definitely is one of the big offenders here. You have bad dialogue, and then you have Terrence Malick dialogue, which is bad dialogue disguising itself as good dialogue when it really is just bad dialogue. And then you have this, which it's not like Terrence Malick's dialogue, and that I do believe that this stuff was well written, but it's almost too well written. It's like every line is trying way too hard to be poetic and deep, and it just eventually started to get obnoxious to me. There are still a few good lines that I liked, but overall it just seemed so overwritten and over the top, and luckily the actors do sell it. In fact, if I liked this movie, which I'm not saying I do, I'm very split on it. The actors really made it work for me. All the performances are strong. There's not a weak link in the entire movie, and I felt everybody had enough screen time to show off. Even the bit players like Ruben Blades or John Leguizamo, they have each one scene between them, and but those scenes, they obviously are having a lot of fun, and they get a lot to do within that limited screen time. And then, of course, you have guys like Javier Bardem and Brad Pitt, who do have much more substantial roles, but they shine within their limited screen time. But the two people who really stole the show for me was Cameron Diaz. Surprisingly, I actually thought she was kind of scary in this movie. She's playing a much more a very cold character compared to what she usually does, and she really sold it, and I was impressed with her. And then Michael Fassbender, who, even though his character I thought was very poorly written, like they never really do a good job at explaining his motivations. You never really get a sense of who this guy is and why we should feel bad for him. It keeps going back and forth as to whether he was always kind of a greedy, smug asshole to begin with, or he was a decent person who made some bad decisions. I honestly never really knew what that was. Maybe that was the point all the way through the ending. I never really got a good sense of who this guy was. But Michael Fassbender did a spectacular role within, or a spectacular job within that role. When he breaks down during the second half of the movie, it feels real. I was really impressed with him. Anything else I could say? You know, it's one of those movies where the first half is obnoxiously slow, but the second half does pick up to where, yeah, at times I was very, on the edge of my seat. It could be very suspenseful and intense. There's definitely a feeling of bleakness surrounding the entire film, where you could definitely see it going down some really dark territory, and maybe that it won't end on a happy note. It's always nice when a movie keeps you guessing up until the very end, and the ending itself was very reminiscent of No Country for Old Men, in that it ends very anticlimactically, and actually the actual ending is really just a character talking, and you're kind of wondering, did this mean anything, or was it just a bunch of nonsense that's trying to convince you that it means something? I guess I got it, but I still thought No Country for Old Men did it a lot better. But still, I gotta give it credit for having some balls. It was a very unconventional ending at the absolute least. So that's really all I got. Unfortunately, though, the second half, while better than the first half, it still does have a lot of downtime where characters will give out their long speeches that are so overwritten. But at least I was interested to a point. So would I recommend this? I don't know. I really do feel that it's almost a love it or hate it kind of deal, and I don't think the hate it aspect comes from it being a bad movie, but it is a very disappointing one. I expected a lot more, and I don't know, it's really difficult to talk about because the novelist mentality I don't think worked for me anyway, but you might love it. But it's almost like, The Fourth Kind. I know that's a weird example, where you're either going to like it or hate it based on its gimmick. In that film, well, it was a gimmick. Here, it's just a writing style. And it really doesn't amount to more than that. You're just either going to get it or you're not. And I didn't care for The Fourth Kind for the reason, pretty much, that I didn't care for this film that much, except I think this film was still better. But I don't know. I feel like... I feel like I'm kind of walking into a wall with this. I really do not know what I feel about this movie. All I know is that I didn't care for it too much, but that doesn't mean it's bad. I don't really know if you should watch this or not. I think it might be best to just wait till it comes out on video. Don't spend a lot of money on it. But you might find yourselves loving it when I didn't. So that's really all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please read my written reviews. Recently I've done written reviews of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Event Horizon, and Glimmerman with Steven Seagal. So please check those out and follow me on Twitter. Hopefully I'll get my next episode of Critiquing the Critics up next week. Don't cross your fingers, though. And that is all I've got, so I'll see you guys later.